So for this presentation, we're going to cover the problem statement and the data that we used, as well as the technology. Going to give a demonstration and then followed by the summary of the pros and the cons. So the problem that we faced was we had an application that we were developing. This was a web application targeted towards community outreach in the state of Tennessee for members of the community who didn't have access to information regarding activities that they could be part of. Our application was in the GitHub repository, and we had identified AWS EC2 Linux instance as an instance to host the website for our testing and potentially for production. And thus we were looking for a deployment option that would allow constant deployment as soon as a commit was applied into the EC2 instance, whereupon we would build and publish the website. So for this exercise, we identified AWS Codedeploy as a potential service to execute this. It is offered by Amazon, deploying applications from S3 repositories or GitHub into an AWS instance. You can also create, as part of the deployment configuration, triggers that would notify users of any deployment failures or instance failures via an AWS SNSQ. For this exercise, we didn't have any data set or code that we had to develop. The only code being the application code that we had existing in GitHub. After creating the instance in EC2, we had to run an update on the OS to make sure everything was set for deployment. So there are three main steps in executing deployment in creating a deployment configuration for our application. The first step was configuring a Amazon Codedeploy. So this involves putting together a deployment configuration which has instructions on what instances to deploy to and what are the rules for deployment in terms of one at a time, all of them at once, and what constitutes a deployment failure. The second step was creating webhooks in GitHub, which would allow automatic deployment of the application from GitHub into our instance based off of any successful commits. And the last update was updating and creating a file in our solution that had specifications on which files to move as part of deployment and where to move them within each instance. So for the code deployment configuration, Amazon has two main options. The first option is a custom creation of a deployment configuration, and this is based off of you having an existing application and an EC2 instance. The second option assumes that you are new to AWS Codedeploy and to AWS in general, and so creates three instances for you, as well as providing a sample application to deploy so you can see what the results are. In our case, even though we had an application residing in GitHub, we opted to go with the sample application because it configured the service roles and the agents that are required as part of deployment. I'm just going to switch and show the configurations that we had put in place for our deployment. So to start off, our existing configuration is placed under a general container code community tables, which is also the name of the application that we're developing. So in this community tables, you will notice we have a community table deployment group. And this deployment group has all the information regarding our required deployment. One of the things that we have in place, as I've mentioned before, was a trigger which would send a message to the AWS SNS queue in any case of a deployment failure or success, or if it's been stopped or rolled back, or if an instance has failed. It also creates a service role, as I had mentioned, and the service role has access to the EC2 instances and can deploy the application, and the app deployment is run under the service role from our source, which is either in GitHub or in AWS S3 and into the EC2 instance. This is a summary of the last deployment that we did, which was on the 9th of December. Going into the configuration group that we have, deployment configuration group, you can edit the instances which you want to deploy, and this is based off of the key that's associated, the tags that are associated to those instances. So in our case, the tag that we have has a key called name and the value of community tables. Further down, you can create any additional triggers that you need and any alarms. So these are based off of metrics that you may require and can be set in Amazon CloudWatch. We have it set so that anytime deployment fails, it is rolled back, and that way we make sure no code is deployed into the EC2 instance. And the last section details the service role ARN, which has access, which grants AWS CodeDeploy access to the instances to which to deploy. As part of configuring the deployment application and the deployment group, AWS also created 3 instances under which the application can be deployed. All of them are standard AWS Linux instances, as we had specified, and have a T1 micro instance type. The application that we were deploying resides in GitHub, as mentioned. It is a JavaScript web application, and for our deployment, we had to provide an app spec YML file. This file, which is in the root folder, specifies where in our instances to deploy the application and the source of the code. So in this case, the single backslash specifies that every file in the root folder, so every file and folder, should be deployed, and it should be deployed to the EC2 users home folder under the folder community tables. It also specifies what kind of environment to deploy to, or what kind of environment it is deploying into, in which case it is a Linux instance. And so, to showcase how this would work, I'm just going to quickly show you the webhooks that are in place So we have two webhooks, one for AWS Codedeploy and one for GitHub auto deployment. The first one grants GitHub access to your AWS account based off of the secret key and the access key provided. It also specifies which configuration to use, which in our case is the community table group. The second configuration is the GitHub auto deployment, and this is the service which monitors your repository, and anytime a commit occurs, knows to call the AWS Codedeploy service to start deployment. Going back to the home folder, if I was to make a change to one of these files, specifically the README, if I was to add, for example, let me just click edit, change this number to 3, and commit the change. As soon as I commit the change, the service, the GitHub deployment service, will call the AWS Codedeploy service to trigger deployment. As you can see in this case, our deployment is in progress, and it should be deploying to the 3 instances that we specified. If you navigate to the drop-down, there is a summary which tells you all the deployments in progress. And in our case, the deployment that we just executed succeeded. This deployment provides you with the commit ID, which was used as this deployment. So if you go back to our GitHub and we navigate to our application, we can confirm that the commit that we specified, which is C7817, is the same one that's specified, which is C7817. And we can confirm that it's deployed to all 3 instances. Going back, we can identify the DNS and go into the instance. And we can confirm that the deployment has occurred successfully. As you can see, the community tables folder was created in the home directory of the EC2 user. And if we navigate into the folder, we can see that all our files have been moved. In addition, we also have an SNS queue that has been set up under which any changes in the deployment or any initiated deployment will lead to a message being published to this topic. And I'm going to use a dummy email account that we have set up for this demo to show the message that has come in. As you noticed, it sends two emails, one regarding the deployment that's been created and one regarding the successful deployment of the application. So, in summary, the good thing about AWS CodeDeploy is it's quick and easy setup based off of the sample application guide. Once you've used that to configure the instances and the services, you can change the configuration so that it can source from your GitHub repository, as I've shown, or you can do an ad hoc deployment which you can specify where you want it to do, so from S3 or from GitHub. The disadvantage is it currently only supports S3 and GitHub as the source of the data, and there is no feature to specify how frequent deployment occurs. In an ideal scenario, deployment would normally occur at the end of the day after all the changes and commits have done, instead of continuously. If AWS EC2 instance is the desired hosting service, then CodeDeploy is a valid service for deployment code. If coupled with AWS Code Build, you can get complete build and deployment of the application, so that you don't have to navigate into the EC2 instance to build the solution and deploy it. The roadblock, as I mentioned earlier, would be the lack of integration with other third-party data sources, as this would be helpful for projects that do not host the data in AWS, so in GitHub or AWS S3.